support this. UAE, Kuwait also, they showed different action. And I think those countries are capable of using their will in order to support this. The international community need a way out, a scenario that will help them to support the rebels. I think Qatar, UAE, Kuwait could be, or the GCC country could be the way to help the rebels in a way, in finding a solution to help them.
And one of these ways out that has been consistently mentioned, but nothing seems to have been done, is obviously the idea of directly arming the rebels. It's been debated for a while now, but most recently Britain once again dismissed that suggestion. Let's take a listen to what Britain has to say.
As I explained to the House last week, we are not engaged in arming the opposition forces. We are prepared to supply non-lethal equipment, which will help with the protection of civilian lives and the delivery of humanitarian aid. Given the urgent need of the Interim Transitional National Council for telecommunications equipment, the National Security Council has decided this morning to supply them with such equipment.
All right, well, that is the stated position of Britain's foreign minister. But Daniel Korski, isn't it reasonable and rational to assume that behind the scenes there is activity going on? Isn't it reasonable to assume that these private militias that have been so active over the past 10 years or so in the rest of the Middle East are operating inside Iraq, and they're getting help from people like William Hague and Washington, D.C.?
I think if the Foreign Secretary is saying to the House that the British government is not supplying lethal support to the rebels, that is the case. But it is probably also the case that a number of countries are trying to provide the kind of military advice the rebels so clearly need. A lot of the discussion recently has focused on arms or not arms. The real truth is that the rebel force remains a ragtag movement which consists of some people of considerable military capability and the rest are volunteers. And the real challenge over the next couple of weeks is going to not just to be training to train people, but to ensure that they have a rudimentary organization, that they can communicate with each other on the front, and they have a command and control system like all successful rebel movements must have if they want to win on the battlefield. And I think a lot of governments are probably supplying that kind of assistance at this moment. Then there's a sort of second question, which is, in addition, will the rebel movement need some kind of private sector assistance, some kind of support from the quote-unquote dogs of war, the mercenaries that have operated in Africa for the last 15 or more years? It may be the case. It's going to be controversial, of course. We have seen in some countries, Sierra Leone, Liberia and so on, where the involvement of mercenaries has been positive, in support of a democratically elected government against an undemocratic rebel force. But we've also seen examples of the opposite. And that's going to be a very controversial issue.
Jumal Gamati, the situation is a vexed one, isn't it? But the idea of arming the rebels is one that William Hague says Britain will not condone, but it will allow the idea that perhaps the Arab nations should be allowed to get involved in a much more active way. Does that make any more sense?
Indeed, it does. It makes a lot of sense. And by the way, I just want to qualify what I said earlier. I think Egypt and Tunisia on the whole are very sympathetic to the Libyan people, and they have been very supportive, especially on the popular side, but also on government side. And I think, you know, it will look much less controversial globally if some Arab and Muslim countries came to the aid of the Libyan people, even by arming, supplying arms, training. I'll tell you what, I'll go even as far as saying, as a Libyan, I would welcome Arab troops on Libyan soil to protect our cities and civilians. That will not be controversial at all, and the Libyan people would welcome that. I also, obviously, we salute the Gulf states' position politically, and they have been very solid and very supportive of the Libyan people. But countries like Kuwait indicated in the last couple of days that it will recognize the Interim National Council. I wish they could do that very quickly. Also, the UAE, who have been very supportive, they could do that. Morocco, for example, could recognizing the Interim National Council as the legitimate representative of the Libyan people will pave the way politically for many Arab countries who make that recognition to actually engage and give logistical support, training, arms, you know, a lot of support, and that will, you know, make it less controversial, and we will not need to go to countries like Britain or France or even America for that. I think this is an urgent need. If there is an agreement, if there is a consensus that Gaddafi and his sons are finished, they cannot be accepted, nobody will ever engage with them, they should not be allowed to crawl back to power in Libya again, and that the only way for them is to leave, then every effort should be done to support the Libyan people to bring about this conclusion sooner than later. It's just a matter of time, but the more effort, the more Arab support, the more Muslim support. Turkey's position is very unfortunate, but the more support from Arab and Muslim countries, the quicker this is brought to conclusion, the less bloodshed and the less misery for everybody, and the region can move towards a more stable situation for everybody.
Al-Ajmi, the question there was posed, why doesn't Kuwait actually come out more forcibly in favor of the transitional government? But the broader question behind that is also such that are we to understand that the Gulf nations are so united in this that they would perhaps take on Washington if there was a conflict of interest in this situation?
Yeah, actually, the GCC countries have clearly supported the Algerian people, the Libyan people in many different ways. However, still, Qatar initiative was the clearest among the GCC countries. However, it seemed to be agreed upon in the GCC countries that supporting the Libyan people it's one of the step that's needed to help them. However, recognizing the national security was one of the requirement steps. Kuwait initiative was very important because it's the second country in the region that talk about it. However, it's needed time. Some internal issues like the last government have left the office and the new government in place. This is taking time. However, it's obvious that Kuwait declaration in itself was a recognition that Libya is there is a new stage, and there is no way to recognize Al-Qaddafi nor his sons as representatives of the Libyan people. What is very important also for us in this region, in the GCC country, that we're thinking that a very important issue most of people not thinking about is dividing Libya to two sides, one the rebels and one Gaddafi and his group. However, we think that it's the whole Libya, half of Libya is under right now torturing. The rebels, at least they have some freedom. However, people who's under the control of Al-Qaddafi regime, they are being tortured, they are being forced to cheers for a dictator who's killing his citizens. So I think a serious support. And one final point in this regard, I would like to speak also about Qatar movement in the whole support in the oil process of the Libyan oil company. I think that is what we need. We need a GCC country help to the Libyan people to be able to create a state that organized not only the military but the whole system, and that can be done in Benghazi, trying to create a system to help the Libyan government, the new Libyan government, in order to recognize, to reorganize itself in the military level and as a state.
Juma Al-Gamati, I just want to put the same question to you about the composition of any kind of a Gulf force and the motives of the Gulf Cooperation Council at the moment, because you've clearly expressed a preference that the Arab nations should take the lead in helping the Libyan people, whether it be with further military training or arming or otherwise. But to what extent are you confident that the GCC is united enough, has a strong enough and regular enough leadership that it's making decisions on behalf of its own people, as opposed to having much more of a Western influenced agenda?
No, I think the GCC have been motivated by an Arab agenda. They were very resolute, very strong from the beginning. They came out in the support of the Libyan people. They could not accept this manslaughter, this madness that Gaddafi has been engaged in over the last 6 weeks, and rightly so. So I think the motives are clear, they are sincere, and we appreciate all of that. All I'm saying is that we thank you very much for what you have done so far, but please, we need more. I mean, you know, Arab forces coming in to guard the cities, for example, to guard the civilians. then that will allow the Libyan revolution fighters to be more engaged with chasing these Gaddafi security battalions and try to reduce their capacity and wither them down.
We're almost out of time, but gentlemen, let me ask Daniel Korski finally then, if we want more, if we're going to authorize more, what exactly does that mean in terms of NATO's and the UN 1973 resolution? How much more are they able to give, do you think?
Well, first of all, I think it's very important that we move away from these old, staid distinctions between what are in the interest of the West and what are in the interest of their people. There is clear a unified interest across a much broader spectrum of nations in the Middle East and in the West in helping the Libyan people free themselves of the kind of oppression that Gaddafi has represented. I think that's very important to acknowledge now. That said, there are, of course, fissures both inside NATO and some distinctions and disagreements across the alliance. And I think, for example, Egypt, though people are sympathetic in Egypt to the plight of the Libyans, the government itself is struggling with a number of transition issues itself. So I don't think we're going to expect a lot of support. In terms of the future,
but very quickly, if we are going to talk about arming the rebels, whether it be by the West or by the Gulf, by the GCC nations, is there a need for a new UN mandate? Is the existing structure able to accommodate that?
I don't think there's an interest in a new mandate. I think it's going to be very difficult to get a Security Council resolution through. The fact that the Chinese and the Russians were willing to acquiesce to this resolution doesn't mean that they're willing to do so again in future. So I think that there's going to be a desire to keep the resolution as it is, to continue to beaver away with the NATO mission, of course adjusting it so that it can be more effective than it has been in the last couple of days, but then bilaterally on the side try to assist the rebel forces in ways in which allow them to resist the kind of offensive that Colonel Gaddafi is still continuing against his own people.
And that is where we're going to have to leave it, gentlemen. Thank you very much indeed to all of you. That was Daniel Korski joining us from London. We were also joined from London by Juma Al-Gamati, and in Kuwait, Abdulhadi Al-Ajmi. Thank you all for speaking on Inside Story today, and thank you so much for joining us on this edition of the programme. We always welcome your comments and suggestions. Email them to us at insidestory@aljazeera.net. But for the moment, it's goodbye.